Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
When my mother pressed a glass into my hand later, acting like it was an apology wrapped in crystal and good intentions, I already knew how I would hold it, how I would smile, and how I would make sure it ended up somewhere that would finally say what I had been trying to say for years without begging, which is that I am not the person you get to forget and then soothe with something expensive while you tell yourself you did your best. I did not arrive at that decision in a flash of temper, because I am not reckless, and I am not dramatic for the sake of attention. It came from a long, steady trail of moments where my mother made my sister the center of gravity in every room we ever shared, and then taught the rest of us to orbit without complaint, which I did for so long that the muscle memory of swallowing things I should have said became as automatic as breathing, until the night that was supposed to be mine and turned into theirs without either of them even pretending to hide it. I had been working toward that award for years that felt like a slow climb with no handrails, where you show up early and stay late and say yes to the projects no one wants because they are complicated and thankless. And you figure out how to stay calm when someone else gets credit for the groundwork you laid, and you do it again anyway, not because you are a saint, but because you want to be undeniable. And when my manager told me I was getting recognized for it at a formal ceremony, I called my mother first, because even grown women with steady paychecks and their own apartments sometimes still want the person who raised them to sit in a chair and clap when their name is called. And my mother said, "Of course, baby, of course I will be there. I am proud of you." I believed her, even with the voice in my head that knows how often her calendar melts around my sister's needs like it is made out of sugar, even with the history of last-minute changes and priority swaps, because I have learned that if you live in permanent doubt, you never get to enjoy anything, and I wanted to enjoy this. The day of the ceremony, I got a text from my mother in the afternoon, all sweet and casual, asking what time the program actually started, because she needed to swing by Sophie's place first to help her sign something and look at a couch she was thinking of. And I told myself not to panic, because it was still fine and there was time, and I sent her the exact time with a heart at the end, because I was trying to be the cool-headed daughter who does not spiral when small plans shift. And then an hour before I needed to leave, she called and said she was so sorry and she hated this, and she would make it up to me. But Sophie had an emergency with the movers at her new building, and there was a whole thing with the parking, and the manager was being difficult. And she promised they would be cheering me on from there, and she would take me to a fancy dinner later that week to celebrate properly. I stood there with the dress I had picked for the stage and listened to the apology that was built like a padded room, soft on the surface and suffocating once you are inside it. And after she hung up, I sat down and had the kind of cry that is not loud or messy but just steady, because I knew I would still go, and I would clap for others. And I would smile in the photos, because the only thing worse than being let down is letting yourself become the kind of person who ruins her own night on top of it. I went to the ceremony and did what I planned to do, and I will not pretend it was not beautiful to hear my name and look out at rows of people and feel something like relief mixed with pride. And I will also not pretend I did not notice the empty seat that would have been hers, or that I did not keep checking the door during other people's speeches, as if she might still appear with a half-breathless excuse and a hug that would be enough. Because even though I know better, hope is a stubborn habit. I took the official photo holding the plaque and sent it to her with a simple line that said, "We did it," and I put my phone away to stop punishing myself with the way nothing pinged back. When I got home later that night, still wearing the dress I had chosen with her in mind, I opened my phone to a story my sister posted, the kind she always posts when she wants the world to know she is thriving, where the caption was about fresh starts and luxury square footage and how grateful she is for family, and in the background of that short clip my mother was laughing and clinking a tall flute against my sister's, both of them in a kitchen I recognized from the listing Sophie had sent weeks earlier, and the sound that came out of me was not a sob and not a scream, but something in between. The sound you make when you realize you have been cast in the same role for so long that everyone assumes you will hit your mark and never change the script. I could have called and fought and said the things I had stored up for years, but I have learned that yelling into that kind of wind only makes you hoarse while the weather stays the same, so I let the anger cool into something sharper. and more useful. And when my mother texted me the next morning with a message about being so proud and sorry and can we do dinner soon, I typed back that dinner would be nice and that I appreciated her thoughtfulness. And then I put my phone down and started planning what gratitude might look like when I stopped trying to be the good sport. Because a week later, she would hand me that glass of wine at her dining table, and I would thank her with a smile, and I would turn to my sister and say she should have it, because she had such a big week and I wanted her to enjoy it. And before the glass touched her lips, I would catch my mother's eyes, and she would recognize, too late, that this time I was not swallowing anything. A week after the ceremony that managed to happen without the one person I wanted in the room, my mother called with the tone she saves for moments where she plans to tidy a mess without admitting there was one. And she suggested we do a small family dinner because she missed me and she wanted to celebrate properly. Which sounded nice on the surface, but in my head translated to a carefully staged evening where she could perform motherly warmth with witnesses and walk away believing she had patched it all, and because I know her patterns and I also know mine, I said yes, because sometimes you have to let the show start if you intend to end it differently. The evening arrived in a blur of messages and calendar reminders, and that slight clench in my stomach that always happens before I see them together. Because there is a rhythm to how the conversation always tilts towards Sophie's news and Sophie's problems and Sophie's bright plans, and how my mother slips into that role she loves where she is equal parts manager, cheerleader, and bank, while I do the emotional math of whether to bring up what happened or let it sit like a lump under a rug everyone pretends not to trip over. I got there a little early because I have this habit of showing up on time even when no one else does, and I found my mother in an unusually soft mood. The kind where she touches your arm and asks how you are with a seriousness that would be moving if you had not seen her put the same tone on like a jacket when the situation demands it. And when I told her I was fine and work was good and I was still proud of the award, she smiled like I had given her an exit ramp, and she said she had felt terrible about missing it, but there had been chaos with the move, and you know how managers are when they spot an opportunity to get extra fees, and she knew I understood because I am sensible and generous that way. And she had something that she thought might make the sting a little less sharp. She walked to the sideboard and picked up a single bottle, the kind of label that makes people nod as if they can taste the price, and she said she picked it up because it is special and she wanted me to have the first pour, and in that moment I felt the familiar split inside me between the part that wants to accept anything that looks like care and the part that recognizes manipulation when it is dressed up as generosity. And rather than argue with either part, one did what I always do when I want to stay clear-headed, which is to slow down and let silence do some of the work. Sophie arrived right then with a breathless hello that sounded like she had jogged from admiration to admiration. And she dropped a comment about parking being a nightmare everywhere except her building, because they have a private garage and a concierge who knows her name already, which earned the laugh from our mother that makes me want to step outside and count to 10. And then she kissed my cheek and said she was still mad about missing my big night, but the move had been a beast and she had barely slept, and could we please just relax because she was running on fumes, and our mother nodded like a conductor and told us to sit because she had something to mark the moment. She put one glass down in front of me with a little flourish, and then she set the bottle beside it without reaching for another glass, and she said she wanted to toast to my achievement properly, just the two of us, and there it was. The tiny stage she had built where she could be the loving mom in a spotlight that would erase the empty chair from last week's photo, and I felt the anger rise and settle into something steady, not hot or wild, just firm. I thanked her, because politeness is a tool when you use it on purpose, and I let the glass sit there untouched while she told a story about a client at her old job who used to send her thank you gifts that were never quite right. The subtext being that some people just do not know how to show appreciation in the way you can really feel, and Sophie laughed and said gifts are tricky because intention matters more than execution, which is exactly the sort of sentence she uses to absolve herself when she drops the ball, and my mother nodded and reached for the bottle, asking if she should pour now or wait until the main course, and I watched her hand tilt and the deep red slide, and I heard the small sound the liquid makes when it hits glass. And I felt an almost physical click inside me as the plan that had been forming since the night of the ceremony moved from thought to action. I picked up the glass, and I looked at my mother long enough for her to register something different in my face, and then I smiled, the kind of calm, friendly smile that never sets off alarms, and I said that this was so thoughtful and I appreciated it, and I wanted to do something thoughtful too. Because if the point was to celebrate, then it made sense to share the moment with the person who had given us all such a busy week with her exciting new place, and I turned toward my sister and told her, in a voice that made the compliment feel sincere, that she should have the first sip because she had earned a little joy after all that work, and because I was genuinely curious to hear her expert opinion, since she had become the family sommelier of taste and tastefulness. Sophie blinked, surprised and pleased the way she always is when a spotlight swivels her direction, and she said I did not have to do that because it was my night, and then she laughed and said she would never say no to a good pour. And she took the glass with a little flourish of her own, while my mother looked at me with a small crease between her eyes, as if a draft had found its way under a door she thought was sealed. I lifted my water and said I would join the toast in a second. I just needed a sip first because I had been running around all day and my throat was dry, and I watched the two of them in the kind of quiet that makes people talk without realizing they are doing it. My mother beginning a speech about daughters and pride and forgiveness and family being complicated, Sophie nodding like a queen, and as my sister raised the glass toward her lips with that smug little grin I have known since grade school, I felt the whole room tilt toward the moment I had been engineering. With soft hands and steady breath, and I thought, let's see who learns something tonight. Sophie held the glass with that easy confidence she has always had when she senses the room has turned in her favor, and she gave one of those tiny nods that are supposed to look humble, but always land like a personal victory lap. And before she could launch into a self-congratulatory aside about moving trucks or accent walls or whatever new adult milestone she had decided counted as character, I said, in the same steady voice I use when I am managing people at work and need them to think this is all routine, that I was glad she would be the first to taste it because she has sharper opinions about wine than I do, and also because she once told me that the expensive bottles are wasted if you drink them with a tired mouth, and she laughed. Because she did say that once after a holiday dinner where she complained the whole time that the cranberry sauce messed up the tannins, and the nostalgia of remembering herself as a discerning person seemed to be exactly the warmth she wanted, which gave the moment that cheerful tap on the shoulder that makes people less careful than they should be. My mother's smile faltered a little, the way it does when she knows there is a piece of information she cannot place and it won't stop knocking, and I could feel her attention sharpen as if she was running a checklist in her head. Because she knows Sophie's stomach tantrums, and she knows the headaches that arrive like an unpaid bill when my sister drinks certain things too fast on an empty stomach, and she also knows that I know those things, not because I weaponized them over the years, but because I am the one who remembers who needs what and when, which is a role I fell into as the responsible child and kept because someone had to. Sophie, meanwhile, was happy to perform, and she swirled the glass because that is what people do when they want to look like they learned something in a tasting room, and she said something about the nose that meant nothing. And my mother made a little appreciative noise as if we were at a restaurant where the waiter is watching and you want to prove you belong there, and in that quiet second before the sip I watched my mother's eyes flick to the bottle, then to me, then back to Sophie, and I knew she was about to speak up with some small, practical comment about pacing or food first or maybe the aspirin in her purse, but pride pinned her tongue, because interrupting would have exposed the truth about the apology. It was not for me, it was for her. And the moment required me to be the grateful recipient playing the role as written, so she stayed still, and I, who have spent years watching her choose the optics over the impact, let the script hold just long enough for the audience to believe it. What made this work was not poison or tricks or anything that could be argued over later with accusations about going too far, because I did not need to do anything except step back and let the physics of our family do the heavy lifting. Since the bottle was a bold red that my sister loves in theory and tolerates poorly in practice, especially when she is running on coffee and adrenaline and the kind of attention that makes her forget to eat, and my mother had poured it generously because Generosity was the whole point tonight, and I knew that the first sip, if it was big and showy, would hit like a small punch to the gut that might make her cough or grimace or set the glass down a little too hard. And all I needed was for whatever happened next to be seen by my mother as the consequence of her own staging. I was not counting on humiliation, because that kind of planning always turns ugly, but I was counting on the truth to become visible for once, which is that my mother had chosen spectacle over substance, and then asked me to thank her for it, and that I could decline without a single accusation by simply letting her watch the plan play out in the hands of the daughter she always protects. Sophie lifted the glass and took a confident swallow, not a careful sip, but the sort of greedy first taste you take when you think the camera is on you and you want to look relaxed and superior. And right away I saw the small tightening around her eyes that says the acid has landed wrong, and she made a quick joke about needing real food, which would have been fine if she had followed it by placing the glass down gently. But she decided to keep talking with the stem caught between two fingers, like a baton, and then she tried to add one more comment about how she could taste something like cherries, which turned into a cough midway, a light cough at first, the kind that should have prompted a pause. Yet she pushed through it because she hates to be interrupted even by her own body, and her hand jolted just enough that the wine lurched up to the rim and wobbled there like a dare. My mother shifted in her chair as if she might reach across the table, then stopped, because to do that would be to admit she had seen the risk and poured anyway, and that is not a sentence she is able to say even with her hands, so she sat locked in this perfect stillness that told me she had, in fact, recognized exactly what was happening and exactly who had allowed it, and I took a long drink of water like I was simply staying hydrated, and I met her eyes over the rim, letting her read the message I was not going to voice out loud, which was that I had accepted her apology and passed it along to the person she always saves first, and if the apology did not go down smoothly, that was not my problem anymore. Sophie tried to recover with a bright laugh that came out hoarse, and she waved off our mother's half-formed question with a breezy "I'm good," which is her favorite line whenever her choices start to boomerang. And she set the glass down a little too quickly on a coaster that did not sit flat, and for a single suspended beat the stemware teetered in a way that turned the entire table into a quiet audience, holding its breath. And I could feel the air shift with that mix of anticipation and dread that families know too well, because we have all lived long enough to understand how one tiny tilt can turn a moment into a memory you will reference for years. And as the bass tapped once and the liquid lapped high again, just about to choose a direction, I kept my face calm and my body still and my eyes on my mother, who finally opened her mouth to say my name like a warning and a plea at the same time, right as the glass made its choice and started to go. Time slowed in that strange way it does when you know a moment is about to harden into something permanent, and as the glass tipped and the wine climbed the lip like it had somewhere urgent to be, I watched my sister try to snatch the stem back to safety with a reflex that was quick enough to touch it and clumsy enough to make the whole thing worse, because her fingers caught the bowl instead of the base, and the pressure she used to correct it only sent the remaining liquid in a fast red arc across her front and onto the table, where it ran toward the center like a line being drawn that nobody wanted and nobody could erase. There was a beat of complete silence while she looked down at the spreading stain with a disbelief that had very little to do with the shirt and everything to do with the fact that things usually bend for her before they break. And then came the breathy sound she makes when she is about to cry, but trying not to, followed by the frantic napkin dab that helps nothing and smears everything, and in the middle of that minor chaos my mother finally moved, not with the clean decisiveness of a person in command, but with the jittery energy of someone who can feel the narrative slipping even as she reaches to recapture it. She started with the usual script, which is to say she said it was fine and it was just a shirt, and these things happen and nobody should fuss, because fussing makes small problems feel big. Yet her hands betrayed the words by jerking from napkins to club soda and back again, and her eyes kept flicking to the bottle as if she could blame the label for being too generous or too dark or too anything that did not put the responsibility where it belonged, which was on the choice to turn an apology into a performance that required props and an audience. Sophie, predictably, tried to salvage the moment with a joke about sacrilege and stains, But the laugh got stuck on a cough that came from somewhere low and mean, the kind that says the drink hit her empty stomach with more ambition than sense. And she waved a hand like she was shooing away the attention she lives for when it is positive and chokes on when it is not, muttering that she was fine and everyone should calm down, which is her favorite refrain when she is falling apart in ways that make other people responsible for cleanup. I sat there with my water glass and my steady breathing and the kind of stillness that is not apathy but control, because I did not need to jump in with instructions or accusations. And I certainly did not need to play the helpful sister who rescues her from the consequences of her own showboating, not this time. Not when the entire point of the evening had been to pretend the harm from last week could be paved over with something that looked expensive and sounded sincere in front of a witness list. My mother glanced at me then, a quick hard look that carried a handful of questions she would never risk saying out loud, and in that tiny, charged exchange I felt years of swallowed remarks and revised memories gather behind my ribs like a tide turning. Because she was measuring me the way you measure a possible threat, and I could see her working through the timeline and the motives and all the little clues I had left on purpose by doing very little and letting her do the rest. What I want to be clear about, and what I would say to anyone who thinks revenge is only real if it is loud, is that none of this required malice or tampering or anything that would let them play the victim with clean hands later. Because I had not touched the bottle before she opened it, and I had not whispered warnings or planted traps, I had only offered the gift back to the favored child like a mirror, and the reflection had behaved exactly as reflections do, which is to show what is there, whether you like it or not. The spill was messy, yes, but it was the kind of mess that tells the truth, because my mother had insisted on centering a toast that should have been a conversation, and my sister had reached for attention instead of balance. And somewhere in the middle of those choices the universe simply gave them what they asked for, which was a memorable scene. The rest of the table tried to recover, because that is what families do when the air gets weird. They push the conversation into safer corners and pretend nothing has shifted. Yet the shift was obvious to anyone who has ever been in a room where the person who holds the power suddenly realizes she is not the only one who knows how to use silence as a weapon, and my mother, who never misses an opportunity to manage everyone's emotions like a project plan, found herself with no good task to assign, because the stain was spreading and her favorite daughter was sulking, and the only person who could have smoothed it over with a wide smile and a quick joke was me, and I was busy sipping water like that was the only drink a sensible person needed. She tried then to redirect with a soft speech about how proud she was, and how families are complicated, and how love can be clumsy but real, and the words rattled in the space between us like coins tossed into a jar that had already been filled with IOUs, because what she really wanted to say was "Did you plan this?" and what she really did not want to hear was "Yes, but not the way you think." Sophie finally stood up with a dramatic huff that would have landed better if she were not damp and embarrassed, and she marched toward the hallway muttering about needing a change and needing everyone to stop staring at her like she had committed a crime. Which made me want to laugh, because attention is oxygen to her until it is smoke, and then she chokes on it and blames the room for not being ventilated properly. My mother called after her with a gentle little nickname that used to work like a reset button when we were kids, and when it failed to bring her back instantly, she turned that careful face on me. The one she uses when she is not sure whether to hug or to interrogate, and she asked if I was going to try the wine now that the glass was free, as if handing me the scene she could not control was a way to regain control. I smiled and said I was fine with water tonight because I had an early morning and a clear head sounded better than a headache, and I held her gaze long enough for her to understand that I was declining more than alcohol. I was declining the entire bargain she was trying to reenact, the one where I absorb the hit and thank her for the opportunity. For the first time in a long time, she dropped the performance and let the discomfort show, a small tightening around the mouth and a narrowing of the eyes that said she was finally connecting the dots she had been scattering for years. And the quiet between us lengthened until it felt like the outline of a confession neither of us intended to say, and in that quiet I realized she was not just embarrassed, she was frightened, not of me exactly but of what it would mean if I had stopped believing that peace requires me to be the one who bleeds for it. The tablecloth was blotched, the bottle sat half empty like a spent idea, and somewhere down the hall my sister was still rustling and cursing softly about stains and dry cleaning. And my mother lifted her water at last and took a slow swallow the way a person does when she needs time to think, and I knew she would try to repair this in the old way after dessert with some story about family and forgiveness, yet I also knew the old way would not work anymore, because the truth had been seen and could not be unseen, and when Sophie's footsteps came back toward us, quicker than grace and louder than apology, I felt the room brace for a new round, and I thought, good, let's finish what we started. Sophie came back to the table in a fresh top and a fresh attitude that was thin as tissue, trying to turn the room back toward her with a few tired jokes about stains and bad luck, while my mother hovered with that bright hostess energy she uses when she needs everyone to agree that things are fine, and I sat exactly where I had been the whole time, with my water and my unspilled calm, and I realized that if I let them, they would restore the same old balance before dessert. They would smooth and distract and declare the evening a success, and by tomorrow the story would be that accidents happen and hearts were in the right place, and I would be back in my usual role as the reasonable one who accepts goodwill instead of accountability. Which is exactly how you lose yourself one polite evening at a time, so I decided to end this my way, not with a speech or a scene, but with something simple that would keep echoing long after I stood up from that chair. I reached into my purse and took out the folded printout I had brought without telling myself why, a single page that held two images side by side. On the left, the official photo of me holding the award at the podium with my name in the caption. And on the right, the screenshot of my sister's celebration story from the same night with my mother's glass raised high, the timestamp visible because I left it there on purpose. And on the bottom, I had written one quiet line in my own hand that said, "This is the toast I needed," and I slid the paper across the table until it touched my mother's fingers, not in a dramatic reveal, but in the same low, steady way you pass someone the bill when you know it is theirs to pay. She looked down, and I watched the armor drop, not all at once, but in little pieces that showed through her face before she could stop them. Because whatever story she had been crafting about the move and the manager and the chaos could not compete with seeing herself reflected in a way she could not edit, and when she finally raised her eyes to mine, I saw something I had not seen from her since I was a kid who asked hard questions. I saw fear that I might be gone in a way she could not charm me back from, and I let the silence sit just long enough for that fear to settle into something like understanding. I told her, in a voice that was calm and slow and gave her nowhere to hide, that I heard her apology and I appreciated the gesture, and I would not be taking it. Not because I wanted to punish her or keep a score, but because I was done accepting gifts in place of honesty, and I said that what I needed was not a bottle or a dinner, it was the sentence she has always refused to say out loud, the one where she admits that on the night that mattered to me she chose my sister and enjoyed it, and that she only remembered I existed when the party moved to her house, and she required my cooperation to make her feel like a good mother again. I did not raise my voice, and I did not ask a question, because I was not looking for an answer that would fix it in one sitting. I was giving her the terms of the next version of us, which would either be built on the truth or not built at all. Sophie started to interrupt with the usual lecture about how life is messy and everyone does their best, and I should not make everything about me, which would have been funny if it were not so predictable, so I held up my hand, not rudely but firmly. And I told her that I was not discussing her, I was drawing a boundary for myself, and that boundary was going to be inconvenient for people who were used to me being convenient, and if she wanted to make it about her she could do that later with someone who volunteers for that job, because I am stepping down from it, effective immediately. I turned back to my mother, and I said I was not angry in the old way anymore, the way that eats your day and wrecks your sleep. I was clear in a new way, the way that lets you make decisions without begging anyone to approve them. And the first decision was that I would no longer play the supporting character in scenes designed to keep her conscience quiet, which meant I would not attend future events where my presence was needed to prove that the family was fine while the truth bled under the table, and I would not pick up last-minute phone calls to solve emergencies that began as choices, and I would not provide the soft landing when gravity finally worked on people who insist it does not apply to them. My mother reached for words then, something about love and regret and how hard it is to juggle two daughters who are so different, and I nodded because I have heard every version, and I respect the effort even when the effort arrives years late. Then I told her the only sentence that mattered, which was that there was a way forward, but it started with her saying the quiet thing out loud to me and not dressing it up, and until that happened I would be protecting my peace the way I have protected everyone else's for too long, and I would not be available to play peacemaker or audience or prop, and I said it with no heat, just finality, because that is what they listen to even when they claim they do not. I stood then, not in anger but in closure, and I placed my hand on the neck of the bottle and slid it toward my sister with a small nod that carried all the history we needed, and I picked up my water, which was still cold and still exactly what I wanted. And I told them both I hoped they had a good evening and that I would be in touch when I was ready to talk about real things in real terms. At the door my mother asked, very softly and very raw, if I had planned the wine, and I told her the truth, that I did not pour the glass. I only passed it to the person who always gets the first pour, and if she did not like how that looked. Perhaps that was the point, and she closed her eyes the way you do when a headache starts in the place where denial used to sit, and she nodded once, not agreement but comprehension, and I left without hugging because I did not want to offer comfort before she earned it. I did not post the photos, and I did not start a fight in the family chat, and I did not tell a cousin or an aunt, because the victory I wanted was not public, it was private and permanent. And it was the right to stop auditioning for a mother who prefers an easier daughter, and as I walked to my car I felt the quiet relief of knowing that whatever story they told themselves about tonight, the part that mattered had already happened, which was that she looked at me and saw the person who finally refused to drink from a glass that was only ever meant to keep me quiet, and when I got home I poured another glass of water and toasted no one, and it felt like the first honest celebration I had had in years.